11 years ago, I was in my basement apartment on Keewatin Avenue in the Yonge and Eglinton area when I got a call. I had been running a hockey pool which I had won, and one of the entrants had yet to pay his portion.
That's always the way.
He had an offer. Instead of giving me what he owed, he would come by early the next day to pick me up. There was a soccer game he'd somehow gotten tickets for. How he stumbled upon these tickets for free wasn't clear. At least it is my guess that he didn't pay for them, because the entry fee to the hockey pool was far less than what it would actually cost to gain entry for this event that we would be attending. This was TFC's first ever home game or home match against the Kansas City Wizards. So on a chilly late April day, I walked through the CNE grounds to BMO Field. The tickets were attached to a scarf, I remember that. And this guy, of course, wanted it back after the game, presumably to sell on eBay. But that's besides the point. What I think about that day now is probably best expressed by what I wrote about it then. This is from Thursday, May 3rd, 2007. Last Saturday, I had a chance to travel to the CNE grounds to check out Toronto FC play in their inaugural match at the newly built BMO Field. I wasn't born when the late Doug Ault hit 2 homers on the Blue Jays' first opening day in 1977, but now I could be part of Toronto sports history that also took place on a chilly April day at the very same location. Although the end result was a 1-0 loss to Kansas City, the crowd rocked the ground, and it was quite evident BMO Field would be an imposing place to play for the opposition. The fan base, whose heart beats in the south stands, with the U section and Red Patch Boys, were equipped with chants and songs, both prepared and drummed up on the spot. One was a chant, "All we are saying is give us a goal," to the tune of John Lennon's "Give Peace a Chance." It is also quite evident that if TFC's poor passing continues, Mike Shropshire might want to sign up to write Seasons in Hell Part 2 starring TFC as the Texas Rangers and Coach Mo Johnston as Billy Martin, but that's another story. The beauty of what MLSE has created in Toronto FC is not only that they will help draw people to soccer, but are taking in people who need no converting. Fans that avidly follow La Liga, the Premiership, and Serie A can unite and support TFC. Whatever league you watch, whatever club you support, people can support TFC with these inherited traditions of being a fan. My team, for instance, is Liverpool, and I know there's been no comparison between the Reds and TFC beyond the color of their jerseys. I've never been to Anfield, and I'd like to go someday before they shut it down. I was at that time assuming they were going to shut it down, and I did eventually go 3 years later. However, as I was walking away back after the game to our parking spot along Lakeshore, my imagination ran away with me a little. As O Canada played, the crowd at BMO Field sang at the top of their lungs, many with their TFC scarves held high above their heads. Seeing as how TFC is the lone Canadian team in MLS, could O Canada double as our version of Liverpool's You'll Never Walk Alone to start each match? Could the boisterous section at the south end that was the pulse of the atmosphere all day long and will be for the foreseeable future be the MLS version of the Cop? That years from now will be the talk of the MLS. For fans of soccer in North America, it may be a place that you are drawn to by unseen forces, such as the same way I was drawn to LFC as a boy, watching Soccer Saturday hosted by Graham Leggett in the late 1980s. All of this seems possible because for the first time in a long time, it seems that an ownership group had it right and has it right with soccer in Toronto, or football if you prefer. Tradition never was manufactured, as it is seemingly with every expansion team in every sport. The currents were here, and they were channeled. Now flows a sea of red and gray that is certain to rise over time into something very special. Here's the prologue, Nate. I went to a handful of games over the next few seasons, but eventually I tuned out. The team was terrible. I gained passing interest once again after a few seasons ago, when many jumped back on the bandwagon, as people usually do when a team gets good. The giant gap between having a shiny new team in the city to when it actually became a contender was quite simply cavernous. I'm Neil Acharya, and this is SportsLit, and I'm pleased to bring in Nate Sager to discuss Come On You Reds, the story of TFC, a newly released book by Joshua Kloke that was released a few weeks ago, and I appreciate it particularly because it filled in that gap that I talked about between when there was a shiny new expansion team to when the team got good. There was that horrible stretch. It was, you could say around a decade almost of the team being really bad. So, Nate, what were your thoughts on the book?
Well, no doubt, I guess Dundurn Press and Joshua Kloke, who's been kind enough to join us today, we're probably hopeful that they'd get a big run from TFC again this year. But everything has an expiry date in sports. I think the timing and tide was definitely right for a book about TFC. You think of those people who really got invested in 2007 right off the hop. They were teenagers, 20-somethings. Now they're at that age where they have disposable income to buy books. And when I look at the success arc of Toronto FC and I guess the MLS, I mean, obviously these things don't go in a straight line. But Neil, one of your aphorisms I often come back to is, when I'm trying to make sense of how things go, is the world gets smaller every day. And I always think the best thing that ever happened for soccer in North America really wasn't even something that happened in North America. It was the English Premier League formed. And then there was like EA Sports FIFA video game franchise that, suddenly no one wanted to play Madden anymore. Everyone wanted to play FIFA, even if they didn't follow or watch soccer. And then after that, when there were all like, the different explosion in 24-hour sports coverage, suddenly you needed something to put on in the middle of the day. So here's the Champions League instead of our 13th rerun today of Kiana's Flex Appeal. Those regional sports network wars, I'm sure they'll be a subject of a Ken Burns documentary someday. And so by the time, Toronto FC came around, I think as Kristen Knowles, puts it so aptly in Joshua's book, there was this, quote, big, small community that was looking for a place to happen. Now, so I'm, really appreciate this book because, for me, soccer was always kind of like Linux. Oh, yeah, that's a great operating system. But I'll have to take your word with it. I'm just going to stick to Windows. I mean, being like the soccer phobe who always got like threatened when the World Cup would, dominate the news every 4 years, always felt like really just kind of regressive and futile. But what got me when TFC had that first home game is like, okay, this is what soccer's supposed to look like. They got the fans with the scarves and the chants, and I mean, they were on field turf, but they weren't playing on a field that had football lines on it. I think I looked it up. I think the first season of MLS, 9 of the 10 teams played in football stadiums. And the team didn't have a goofy name, such as like the Dallas Burn or the Tampa Bay Mutiny. So, but how did the creators of the franchise, how did MLSE manage to get, how did they nail that part? And yet why did it with all the MLSE muscle and might behind it and money? Why did it take Toronto FC so long to crack the code of Major League Soccer glory? So that's what Joshua Kloke has gamely attempted to unpack, and with a plume, and he's refreshed us on some key details of all of Toronto FC's trials and tribulations. We should plug the fact that I think we just passed the 1-year anniversary since our first one. I think some people didn't think we'd get past the second episode. And all of those critics are all on limited profile on social media now. But it's kind of appropriate because I think the day we recorded our first one was the day that Gord Downey's, physical energy was returned to the earth. And Josh has also written a book about the tragic layup called Escape is at Hand. So kind of appropriate here. He's here to join us and kick around the themes in Come On You Reds, the story of Toronto FC from Dundurn Press.
And without further ado, we will bring on, after the break, Joshua Kloke, who is best known for his writing with The Athletic Toronto, and he will discuss Come On You Reds, the story of Toronto FC. This is SportsLit. I'm Neil Acharya, along with Nate Sager, and we're pleased to be joined by Joshua Kloke, author of Come On You Reds, who we talked about in the intro. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Most sports fans will know you from your coverage of TFC and the Maple Leafs for The Athletic, Toronto. Let me backtrack by asking you, first of all, what drew you to sports writing and authorship to begin with?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think... first and foremost, I grew up in a household that had 2 or 3 newspapers delivered every day. And that was pretty incredible to just be able to wake up and, once my dad was done with the sports section, sift through it and kind of just look at the different ways that sports stories were told, and this was long before I kind of thought about doing it formally, but you immediately recognize the differences between a post-game report that's very cut and dry, and a feature with a writer's little photo in the front of the sports section, and it occurred to me very early on, partly because the only time I'd ever be able to stay awake past my bedtime were for Leafs games, that this was the city Toronto that took its sports really, really, really seriously. And I know that sometimes, Torontonians don't always think of themselves as a sports city in the same vein as a Chicago or a Boston. But I found the opposite to be true. I found that, people all across the GTA, even because it's such a spread out city, people cared so much about this team. And I grew up being a fan of different teams. I grew up being a fan of a few teams in Germany, and you realize that there are different ways to tell stories, and like I said earlier, you don't just have to tell stories in a very cut and dry manner. You can tell stories with fans in mind. And again, being a big fan of a few rock and roll bands, and being a big fan of a few different teams, you realize that if you really want to make your stories resonate, you try to write them critically, and you also try to write them with fans in mind, because these are the people that come to the games. These are the people that really care passionately about these teams. So to keep them in mind is something that probably was present throughout the writing of this book as well.
And indeed, that phrase sort of just stuck in my head there, the with fans in mind, because I think the book opens with, like, soccer fans on a message board, like, is an MLS guy really, like, lurking on our message board? I guess you sort of intuited my question. When you were, it takes a long time to make the story short, as Thoreau said. Like, how did you zero in on the structure of the book? Like, what kept you on target during the writing of it?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, you want the reporting to speak for itself. And that's something that Sean Fitzgerald, one of my editors at The Athletic, has just kind of harped into me from day one. Like, get out of the way, let the reporting, let the people who are on the ground speak for themselves, and make sure that kind of dictates where the story goes. And I found that, every single season, TFC had haven't been around for as long as, a few of the other big teams in Toronto, but every single season had its own story. Most seasons for a while there had their own coach, and most seasons had their own vision in terms of, well, here's what we're going to do this year, and this is the new plan, and no, really, this is the plan that's going to work, we swear. And so it just made natural sense to kind of structure it like that. Look at every season, look at the plan coming into it, and then again, look at where it all went wrong and who was impacted, right? Because they haven't been around, like I said, as long as a lot of other teams, but that's kind of interesting because then, every season doesn't blend together as they were. We can call them the Harold Ballard years, and that can encompass a few seasons, and we can call them the Anthopoulos years, and that can encompass a few seasons. But with TFC, every single season had its own weird way of unfolding, so it made sense to me to just kind of look at every season on its own.
I'm going to skip ahead, actually, Joshua, and ask you, with what you just said, how did the timing or lack thereof from the time TFC was awarded a franchise to when they fielded a team affect their I guess, the futility of those not just early years, but well into, I guess, a decade in?
Well, I mean, every sports team, I assume, has its own group of passionate fans. What I think TFC realized or found out very early on, that they had a big group of very passionate fans, and they kind of, I don't want to say fell backwards into it, but I think everybody in team management was really surprised at how fervent this fan base was. And then when you look at the fact that, well, we're also competing for attention against the Leafs, the Jays, and the Raptors, which have, a stranglehold on fans in their own right, it became a rush to get things right. I mean, any club, when they want to build towards a success, it takes time. But TFC looked at, well, we have this passionate fan base. We can't lose them. And just think of how incredible it could be if we win. And so the rush to get things right kind of dictated the way that TFC conducted their business early on. They wanted to get things right out of the gate. And every coach that I spoke to, every coach except one took my call, and they all said the same thing. I wanted to be the one to bring an MLS Cup to the fans in the South End. I wanted to be the one that could do it because, and you know what, if you fast forward until, when Michael Bradley was signed, Tim Leiweke said the same thing Tim Leiweke said the same thing to Bradley and Javinko. Just wait and see what happens when we win. And we saw that when they did win in 2017, that, an MLS club had a parade down, a busy street in Toronto in the middle of December on a Monday to Nathan Phillips Square, and people showed up by the thousands. And I don't know if a lot of other MLS clubs could get that kind of fervent attention. So Leiweke was right, and the kind of the belief or the hope of all those people in management, all those coaches, it was also not unfounded. I mean, they wanted to get things right because they knew if they did, there would be a response unlike anything, that had probably happened in MLS up to that point.
Well, just touching on that, so if you can correct me if I'm wrong, Seattle had 4 years from the time they got an expansion team to when they fielded it, and
that sounds about right.
The LA team as well,
and LA had a lot of time, and Atlanta also had more time than TFC. Right. TFC just wanted to get things going. TFC also had, or I shouldn't say TFC, but the Under-20 World Cup was also in Toronto, and it looked like a good opportunity to sell tickets in conjunction with early season ticket sales. So
right.
You can't really blame them because they sense this wave of anticipation, and they say, "Let's go, let's jump on this." But you realize also that a lot of the people, MLSC had a ton of sporting experience. They didn't have a ton or even a fraction of a ton of MLS experience, soccer experience, people in the know that had, soccer experience. MLS is an incredibly idiosyncratic league, and soccer is an incredibly idiosyncratic sport. And the belief was that, well, we've been successful with the Leafs and the Raptors. How could we not be successful with TFC? And obviously, if you were around, or if you turned on your TV in the mid 2000s, you saw how wrong that belief was, right?
And I guess that maybe segues into what I want to ask. I think the wheels were in motion for this book before that MLS Cup win and before that big parade. But what was the elevator pitch for saying, hey, there's a sellable book about a soccer team in Canada? Because sometimes I'll go in a bookstore and start looking at the sports section, and it's just like, really? More hockey? Like, how did you sort of say this will work to a publisher?
Well, I did get lucky. They came to me, Dundurn came to me and said, we like your work, and they had also contacted a few other writers, and I was pretty hungry to do something, and so I did everything but stand on the table and say I want to do this book because I know what. And this isn't to say that the other writers didn't, but I know what soccer could mean to Canadians. And that's not to say it doesn't mean something, but you get this sense, and throughout TFC's kind of rise, and you get this sense now on the verge of 2026 that soccer is just, it's the wave is just starting to peak, and so many people have an interest, but there's also you're still battling with soccer in Europe where we know these players and we know these teams as global brands, but we don't know, we can't kind of put our own stamp on something unique here. And look, I get that, and that was kind of addressed in the early chapters. I mean, I when I was a kid playing the game, I would go to it was called Soccer City then in Whitby, and I remember I'd walk into the facility every time, and there was this flag, and I knew it was a logo, but I'd never seen that logo before, and I remember asking my dad, I'm like, well, is that Toronto's soccer team's logo? And my dad was frozen. He said, I don't know if Toronto has a soccer team. This would have been in 93, 94. And he's like, I don't know what that is. And if Toronto has a soccer team, I don't know what their logo is. It ended up, anyway, pick up the book, find out which team it is. But you get the sense that there's an incredibly fervent group of soccer fans that all love the sport in their own right, but they never had something to really attach themselves to. And TFC has I think taken a lot of people by surprise, taken the league by surprise. So the pitch was very much just, let's try and capture this wave, and let's try and let's acknowledge the fact that there's, like you kind of said, Nate, like, let's acknowledge the fact that there is a lot of depth to sports in this city. And I've got nothing against people writing books about the Leafs because they're an institution. I mean, I think there should be more Raptors books. I don't know if there are. I think there should be even more Jays books. I know there's a few. But I think that, we do live in a big sports hub. And I hope that there's another TFC book. I hope there's another Canadian soccer book down the line, because this is just, to me, that they're like I said, soccer is just peaking. And I think when you understand that, the amount of people that show up to watch soccer games in the stands doesn't necessarily represent the love of the sport across the country and the city. So it's a kind of a long-winded answer to a short question, but they came to me, I stood on the table, give me this damn book, and I
want
hope,
it.
Yeah, I hope people are into it.
Did you find that you had to find unique ways to market this book because it's not a hockey book? Maybe going to more podcasts or blogs, or was that not the case?
I think if you write a book, and maybe you're the first, you're one of the first books about a subject out there, inherently you want to talk about it a bit more. But in terms of unique marketing, I don't think fate dealt us a fair hand in terms of where, I mean, TFC won. I'd started writing the book before they won MLS Cup. And so you secretly in the back of your mind hope they win just because you want an ending to the story. And then the book comes out and people are just exhausted of this team right now. And that's partly because of, their poor results throughout the MLS season and the fact that they've played so much soccer. I mean, there's been 43 days of no TFC over the past 2 years. So in terms of unique marketing, no, I think you just like to share the process, because you also, like I said, I would like to see more people tell their own stories. I've had people come to me and say, well, maybe writer X or writer Y should have written this story, and that's great. Like, I would like to see more and more kind of perspectives, because my own perspective is quite limited. It's just let's make sure fans are served by this book, and let's let the reporting speak for itself. So unique challenges, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much they're books. You have to hustle to make sure that people are aware of them.
John Molinaro you speaking of other writers, he was kind of woven through the fabric of this book. How valuable was he to you? And tell us who John Molinaro is.
Well, yeah, John Molinaro is I think his title is chief soccer reporter at SportsNet, and he was at CBC Sports before that. I call him the great grandfather of TFC coverage because there's only one or two reporters, I think him and Neil Davidson of the Canadian Press, that were there since day one. I admittedly wasn't when TFC started. I was living in Istanbul at the time, which is another story altogether. But you talk to people that have been there since day one, and you ask them about the early days, and they kind of go white in the face because it brings back some pretty treacherous memories. But no, like you said, you want to see how everybody viewed things, and John wasn't the only reporter that I talked to, but it's important that you understand not just how management and players felt about what was happening then, but how the team was being received. I started really covering the team in earnest around 2014, 2015. So to be able to talk to John was interesting because I can talk to all the coaches as I did, except for one, and they can give me their take, but to understand how this was received and to understand like what it must have been like to cover a losing team year after year after year. And you're balancing that with the fact that, well, geez, in the back of your mind, I really have to fight for this because I can't assume that people just naturally care about this team. Like even when the Leafs were bad, or even, when the Jays were bad, people still will care about this team. You're not fighting to say, well, if they're bad, people will stop reading. And that was kind of a threat with a lot of TFC writers for a long time.
And that's sort of, what I really enjoyed sometimes. I thought sometimes this is really a book about like management techniques, I guess, like the characterizations of like Preki, being off. He was just kind of off on his own orbit, it seemed like. And then Ryan Nelson was the guy who, I'm done playing. I guess I'll just go coach in MLS now. I don't really have any ideas. I'm just going to, go by rote. How much is this book about just the modernization of management in soccer and all pro sports?
Well, a term that has kind of become a point of contention on Twitter for another sport is the idea of hockey men or a hockey man, right? Like this idea that, you grew up in the game and then you coach for a while and you're kind of, an old school guy and you know what you're doing because you're a hockey man. That doesn't really exist in soccer because there are so many different approaches to the game. And because soccer is such a global sport, the way that things are done in England is vastly different from the way things are done in Colombia or the United States or Japan. But all of those places bring a unique approach to the table. And I think that's what TFC tried very early on was, they started with Mo Johnston, who is one of the most well-known Scottish players of all time. And if you're not familiar with Mo, look up his story because what he did with Celtic and Rangers was pretty daring stuff back in the day. And he had just a very nose to the grindstone mentality and let's find hardworking players. And that's intangible, right? And you don't really know if that's going to work. And you move on to, and obviously you're skipping through probably 1,000 coaches as I go through, but you go to Aaron Winter, who's a Dutch coach, and, he believed in young players getting opportunities very, very, very early on, which is very symptomatic of how things work in the Netherlands. And he believed in building from the academy up. And it wasn't about finding players that were hardworking. It was finding players that were very creative on the ball. Is either one a better approach? Well, no, because neither team made the playoffs, right? But so you're right. And then you move forward to Tim Bezbatchenko and Greg Vanney and Bill Manning, who believed in doing things with MLS success in mind, because both Mo and Aaron Winter couldn't get things right. I mean, Mo had success previously, but I think neither understood the salary cap restrictions And, the way that, again, MLS is such an idiosyncratic league. Tim Bezbatchenko and Greg Vanney knew on MLS, and Bill Manning as well. They understood MLS. And I think, again, every coach, when you go back, you think, well, maybe if they had stuck with that would have been really interesting. Aaron Winter in particular, because now TFC is investing so heavily in their academy, and Aaron Winter wanted to do that. And that would have been interesting to see how that would have played out. And again, Ryan Nelson, he was a player's coach. He understood what modern players go through, and there's value in that. Preki wanted to make sure this team didn't fold easily, and that had been but he, Preki comes from I believe it's a Serbian background, and he's a really, really hard man, and he's, he had a lot of MLS success, and he's still in the game coaching with Seattle. A really, really, really hard guy, and you could argue that back then that's what TFC needed. You could maybe argue that's a bit of what TFC needs now, is just a hardened mentality. So every coach brought something different, and every coach was kind of informed by kind of their background. And to me, that's really, really interesting, because it's a study in how Toronto, a very multicultural city, opened up their doors to different coaches with different approaches. And you just have to run the gamut until things work, right?
That's what I enjoyed about the book. I mean, as a sports fan, as a sports journalist, is, I followed TFC and had a real interest off the top, and then I just, like a lot of people, kind of just left it to the wayside when they started losing, and I felt it filled in a lot of the gaps from people like myself that were initially excited, then kind of fell away, and then kind of got back into it once they started doing well.
Yeah, and you're not alone in that regard. I mean, it was. I don't envy management early on for trying to keep, and they had to raise ticket prices, and they had what was interesting. They would have these town hall meetings where they would literally sit at the front of a room and allow fans to throw tomatoes at them, because this was they understood that they had to keep these fans. They also had to answer for them. And I know teams do season ticket holder meetings, but there was an intimacy to these town halls. And the problem was that any sports organization, even though this, again, as I said off the hop, this was a book that was written with fans in mind. Management can't cater to fans, and management of any club should never make decisions with fans in mind. So this was a balance that TFC had to kind of walk, because they knew that we have the best attendance in the league, but we are continually losing. How long do we think this can last?
Thankfully, there was some teams in this city that had a habit of losing around that time.
Right.
So when was, and this is a question that was, I felt I had to ask, because I felt there might be two answers to this, but you can better answer it. When was rock bottom? Was there more than one rock bottom for TFC? Was it 2009? Was it in 2013? When do you think it was, if there was one particular spot at all?
Statistically, it's funny you asked that. I was looking up this morning. TFC now sit on 33 points through 33 games, and I was just kind of looking while I was eating my Cheerios this morning, looking at, how will this season in terms of points per game stack up against some of the most dismal seasons? 2012 statistically was a real low point. Aaron Winter was fired, and TFC fans were just so sick and tired of the turnover and the DPs that didn't work out. I argue, and I might be in the minority here, I argue the low point was 2014, was the end of 2014, because Leiweke comes in, he makes TFC a priority, and he goes big on designated players. Bigger than, and TFC had designated players before, Torsten Frings, and he comes in and says, we're going to make a splash. We're going to get this team into a prominent place in the Toronto sports landscape. And we're going to do it by bringing in one of the most hyped players in TFC history. And we're talking about Jermaine Defoe. And even though, like, I remember watching his first game in Seattle, and he literally scored on his first touch. And I think, like, again, like to compare that, I mean, if you had again, if John Tavares comes in and literally one times his first shot into the back of the net in his first game, people would be losing their minds. Defoe goes on to score a second goal on his third touch, and it looks to me like, they might have gotten it right, and it could not have gone worse. I mean, Defoe had his reasons for wanting out. This team that thought, let's sign big players because that's what our fans deserve, just becomes engulfed in even more drama. And then at the end of the season, you're just thinking, well, they've kind of, like, to me, that was the point where it felt like TFC, it's like, we've kind of done everything. We've done absolutely everything we could. This was the last thing, was spend huge on a huge player. And that blew up in our faces. So to me, that's the low point, because if you're going to, and we're seeing it in MLS now, like, if you're going to sign a big player, you better be sure that the results come with it, because you only get so many designated players, right? And eventually fans are going to start saying, look, you're raising our ticket prices. We know that this player costs a lot of money. Why couldn't you find a player that you knew wanted to be here? To me, that was the real low point, because it was TFC swinging for the fences and saying, we want to be taken seriously as a brand in Toronto, and it just didn't work. Michael Bradley did stick around, of course, and there was a few players from that 2014 that played a huge part in the 2017 win. But to me, the Defoe drama was just something that was a real low point, and also a real turning point for TFC.
That's what I was going to say. Was the bloody big deal in the end that Michael Bradley came out of that whole situation staying with the team?
Yeah, Michael Bradley was, I should say, he was very generous with his time for the book. We spoke for about 4 hours in LA.
In one sitting?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Cool. It was, and it was interesting to hear how he was kind of sold on the club. And, you and I kind of wrote about this at the end of 2017 when TFC won. I mean, Michael Bradley stayed with the team and delivered a championship to Toronto, and it's a championship that, athletes in and around that time, the Vince Carters, the Roy Hallidays, the Matt Sundins, they could never deliver to Toronto, but they had a captain that stayed with it and became the face of the club in a lot of ways. And I know he's kind of a polarizing figure, and I get that. But yeah, I mean, if anything, if there's any highlight to the bloody big deal, it's the fact that Michael Bradley stuck around and really grew into his role in Toronto. Because something that I don't think gets talked about enough is when Michael Bradley was signed in Toronto, I think that there were some people within TFC that didn't really understand who Bradley was and how to best utilize him. And you saw that earlier when Julian de Guzman signed in Toronto as a designated player. He believed that, fans and management were sold on a goal-scoring midfielder, and he was the exact opposite. And Michael Bradley talks about how in 2014, 2015, and even parts of 2016, he was being asked to do everything in the midfield, defensive, central, and attacking midfield. It was only in 2017 where he had players around him that allowed him to play that defensive midfield role, which is where he thrives, that TFC really, really had, their best season of all time.
And going back to Jermaine Defoe, it was a bloody big deal for those that don't know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, please do, because before that you were getting players that were past their prime coming from Europe, and Defoe still was only 31. He still had something to give. Is that correct? Is that landing a player like that was why it was such a big deal to get a player like that to the MLS?
Well, it was kind of believed by some that he, still had a legitimate chance of cracking England's 2014 World Cup squad, which would have been huge. Like to have an English striker,
right?
On TFC. Don't forget, TFC also for a time had Brazil's goalkeeper from that 2014 team. He was on loan, but anyway, that would have been a really big deal. The retirement league thing is something that I struggle with. I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with. It's funny you mentioned that. I kind of got caught with egg on my face really late last night. I'm sure you're both familiar with Old Takes Exposed, that Twitter. So I got caught by them because in May of this year, when the rumors of Wayne Rooney coming to MLS, coming to DC United really, really took hold, and it looked like it was a sure thing, I tweeted something about how it was bad for DC United, and and Rooney was deteriorating very quickly as a player in England with Everton, and if he continued to deteriorate, it would be bad for MLS because it would look like it would only add fuel to the retirement league fire.
Right. He
has, I don't want to say single-handedly, but he has transformed a DC United team that was an afterthought this year into they qualified for the playoffs last night, and I got caught with egg on my face, rightfully so. So I think that the idea of a retirement league is kind of interesting because sometimes you see players come over here and they just set the league on fire. Zlatan, Bastian Schweinsteiger scored in his first game, and you could argue about, I don't think he's been utilized correctly by Chicago, but that's another story. But then you have, sometimes the Lamparts and Gerrards don't work out. So it's kind of, we shouldn't be painting European stars all with the same brush. They all come over here for different reasons, and we shouldn't assume that just because you're player that is 30 or over and have had success in Europe, that's a bad thing for the league.
Tim Lewicki, you talked about him earlier. He was obviously instrumental in the bloody big deal and turning the team around. So what I wanted to do is to get you to explain a little bit about who he is, his background, and then, I don't know, Nate, if you want to hold the mic up for Joshua, well, could you read a little for us from the book?
Sure,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead. Well, first of all, let him explain who Tim is.
Well, yeah. I mean, if you're familiar with Toronto sports in the last 10 years, you should know who Tim Lewicki was. I mean, Tim Lewicki was instrumental in bringing David Beckham to the LA Galaxy. Tim Lewicki, who's with AEG Sports in Los Angeles. The best way I can sum up Tim Lewicki, who was president of MLSC and who came in to MLSC, I believe, in 2013, and made TFC and the Raptors a priority. This is the man that brought Brendan Shanahan in, who I think is about as instrumental as anybody in the Leafs turnaround. This is a man that brought Masai Ujiri in, who's again about as instrumental as anybody in this current kind of Raptors team. And Tim Lewicki comes in and he makes TFC a priority. And I think really fans that understand how things work with TFC have a lot of respect for him because you didn't have anybody at MLSC that had put them at the forefront. And his idea from the beginning was, let's spend big on TFC right now. Let's make them a legitimate brand in Toronto. Let's invest millions of dollars in players. And then eventually we should be able to recoup that investment by the fact that you will have so many more young players wanting to come play for TFC because, Toronto is a soccer hub. I grew up on the fringes I grew up in Oshawa, and we would consistently get our asses handed to us by these teams from Toronto that were so good. And there's so much young talent in Toronto. But for a long time, a lot of these young players didn't want to go play for TFC's academy because they didn't look at TFC as a legitimate option for their careers. Leiwecke's plan, I think, was to say, let's invest heavily, let's make TFC a reputable brand, and then hopefully we'll have these young players come to play in Toronto, and then years down the road, we'll be able to bring these young players in at a fraction of the cost. And we're slowly starting to see that with the Ryan Telfers and Liam Frasers of the world. But Tim Leiwecke wanted to see success with Toronto FC, and it would have been very easy to just, cater to the Leafs fan base and go big on the Leafs. But the work he did with TFC to kind of legitimize it and put the right people in place, because he kind of cleaned house as well. And it's funny, I don't know if it's in the section you're going to want me to read, but talking to a few TFC staffers about him, the best way I can summarize Leiwecke is the way that someone else summarized him. He pisses charm, which is just, you look at just how he made people believe that TFC could be great. And if you were there for the Bloody Big Deal press conference, it was hard not to be swayed by his vision. And it took a while, and there were a few missteps along the way, but they got there. And Leiwecke was also instrumental in finding the right people to kind of succeed him. I mean, he wanted Tim Bezbatchenko in place. He knew he was a soccer wonk who came from the league office and understood the league and understood the ins and outs of the league. And that's someone that they had never had kind of steering the ship before. So I think his influence cannot be understated.
Without further ado, Joshua Kloke on Tim Leiwecke from Come On You Reds. Yeah, it's highlight. Yeah, from the highlight to the highlight.
Tim Leiwecke arrived in late April 2013, and he will never forget the look on Jamie McMillan's face. Leiwecke was already in the middle of cleaning house at Toronto FC when McMillan, the director of team operations, walked into his office with a face as long as the club's list of losses. "We're embarrassed to tell people where we work," Leiwecke remembers her saying. As the newly hired president and CEO of MLSC, Leiwecke had been brought in to deliver stability and success to franchises that sorely lacked it. Having served as the president and CEO of AEG, which maintains ownership either totally or in part of 3 sports franchises that had won 10 championships under his 17-year watch, Leiwecke had the results to back up his boastful, aggressive demeanor. He had made a career of getting what he wanted and delivering results, doing so with a seemingly endless supply of charm delivered through an almost enchanting Midwestern accent. "Was he charming?" I put to one TFC employee. "He pisses charm," they replied. There you go. Leiwecke believed successful franchises had to have 4 key elements: a great fan base, a vibrant market, resources, and an ownership willing to spend. And finally, a talented leadership team of people who are like-minded and ambitious. It was that final component that, in Leiwecke's eyes, was lacking at TFC. So Leiwecke, the self-described glutton for punishment who likes to turn things around, got to work. "We're going to be just fine," he assured McMillan. "We're going to get this right." Leiwecke spent his first months observing how the club operated. What he saw was a club that had become isolationist, beaten down by years of losses on the pitch, and reluctant to open the doors to yet another salesman passing through with a plan tucked in his briefcase. So much so that Leiwecke saw a club not utilizing the resources they already had that could set them apart in MLS. They wanted to be separated from Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, and many within Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment wanted nothing to do with TFC because they saw it as a very strong negative, said Leiwecke. To Leiwecke, as important as Payne's, we're talking about Kevin Payne, past president of TFC, as important as Kevin Payne's experience in MLS had been, he saw an executive whose, quote, heart wasn't really into it. And as to direction, the club was in an ocean with no direction, and to Leiwecke, no real purpose. Payne had previously worked under Leiwecke at AEG as managing director of AEG Soccer, originally tasked with 6 different MLS clubs as part of the league's ownership approach. Payne was well aware of Leiwecke's ambition and tried to quell that ambition in one of their first meetings in Toronto. One of the great things about Toronto was that we didn't necessarily need to spend crazy sums of money on big-name players to be successful, Payne remembers telling Leiweke. He believed the club's audience was sophisticated enough to appreciate good soccer for what it was. And if the team had success, they would support it whether that included household names or not. And quote, and that's not the way Tim wanted to do things. While Payne wanted to build slowly and methodically with the hopes of long-term success, he saw Leiweke as an executive driven by immediate success and splashes in the market. Says Payne, if you think of the club like the Charlie Brown Christmas tree, we wanted to be careful that we don't hang a big, shiny ornament on the tree just to see it droop down to the ground. And that tempered approach from the club at the top, from the top of the food chain, eventually bled into TFC's identity as a club and what they could become. Leiweke believed Payne's approach had undermined the work put in every day by all the employees clamoring for direction. And I think it scared everyone away except for me, said Leiweke. I loved it. I saw it as an opportunity to get it right. Leiweke began trying to get his employees to rediscover that hustle of a startup that had defined the club early in their existence. The culture was defined by the people that had always been there, he said. We kind of got back to the culture that had been there in the early years, but with an infrastructure and a leadership on the team side that allowed us ultimately to succeed.
And that's Tim Leiweke, I guess, in a nutshell. And what I particularly found interesting was when you described what he did, and he stuck around for about 4 months and just watched. That seems exactly what Brendan Shanahan almost did, was kind of watch before he made any moves and then go in and really clean house.
And that was something that perhaps had been, missing with a lot of the club's kind of coaches and management during those years of turnover. People would come in and just say, here's the way we're going to do it right now, this way. And I'm not going to wait and see like the way that things operate. I'm going to make a change because this is what I think needs to get done right away. And that's how, this club became known as one that was defined by its turnover, right?
Nate, I'm going to let you have the mic in a second. I have one final question before we give Joshua, our parting gift. And one of the other gifts I'll give you is I'll make sure I call you Joshua. Sorry.
Oh, that's cool.
So TFC now has the title. That's
for now.
Yeah, they have a title for now. So they've reached that point in their trek, in the trajectory of their existence. Is the big challenge now sustaining a winning culture here?
Well, yeah, it's Pat Riley's disease of more, right? Once you get to the top of the mountain, getting back either isn't as enticing, or the way that you got to the top of the mountain isn't the way you get to the top of the next mountain. The challenge for TFC moving forward is just in the short term, how do you manage a club that's aging? I mean, this is a team with in my opinion, a very talented core of players that obviously can win in MLS because we saw it less than 12 months ago. This is a team that's now 1 year older. Michael Bradley, Sebastian Giovinco, Josie Altidore, which up until, a year ago was regarded as the best kind of, or the most talented group of designated players in MLS. They're all over 30. Their contracts are all up at the end of 2019. So to me, the challenge is how do we get the most out of an aging core? Because it's very difficult in soccer where the draft is not nearly as prominent as it is in other sports. Players are bought and sold, and trades just are not as common, and they're used, but they don't make a big impact the way that buying and selling of players, and a lot of that is determined, or a lot of that is impacted by contracts. How do we get the most out of an aging core that has one more year left on its contracts before we decide what direction we want to go in? Because I firmly believe there's enough in this club, if they are rested and healthy, that can win. They will need to add pieces. They will need to add a center back, because I don't think Drew Moore is going to be back next year. They need to get organized in the back because they were leaking goals this year. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe they're on pace to allow more goals this season than that dreadful 2012 season when sometimes it looked as if there was no goalkeeper between the sticks. They need to slowly inject youth into this team as well, because they can't just, stop at the end of 2019 and say, okay, great, here's, 11 players from our academy. That's not going to work either. So the challenge is making sure that these aging players stay healthy, because I don't think anyone could have predicted just how badly injuries could have impacted the team this season.
Just because we're under a time crunch, switching gears, Bayern Munich plays tomorrow in Champions League.
Yep.
Are you going to watch the game?
Yes.
They're playing AEK Athens. I did some research, and I kind of copped out. And I know a good way to watch soccer is with booze.
Okay.
And so we got you a German booze pack.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. Wow. Very kind. Neil, Nate, thank you very much. What do we got here? Well, I'm gonna have a look, and do you want me to describe?
Yes, please.
I'll see if hopefully I've had some of it. Let me pick this apart here. This is great. Thank you very much, guys.
No problem.
This is Dachshund Pinot Grigio. Okay.
Not exactly high end, but it is from Germany, which was my requirement when I bought it. Apparently, maybe the label.
No. I'm maybe trying to figure out where it's from. It's from German, so it's got to be good. From Germany, so it's got to be good.
Got a couple of beers for you and your wife, perhaps.
Wow. So this is a Weissbier, which is a Bavarian. Weihenstephaner, the world's oldest brewery. Again, comes from Bavaria or Bayern, so it's got to be good. Weissbier is the kind of stuff that goes. A lot of times Bayern matches kick off at 9:30 a.m. And Weissbier is a heavy beer, despite its kind of lighter color. So that's kind of a good morning beer. So
that's the other one's the same. So you got two of the same.
Okay, well this is incredible. This brewery has been around since. Wow. I don't even know how would you say that? 1040?
Oh man,
1040?
I have no idea.
That's incredible. But no, it's This is great stuff. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, on behalf of Nate and myself, thank you so much for joining us, and good luck with the rest of the tour, with the book tour. The book is Come On You Reds, and it was, once again, when was the actual?
October 6th.
October 6th is when it came out. Go and grab yourself a copy. Thanks, Joshua.
Thank you.